Hello, my name is Caro. I work at Urban Resources Initiative, a urban forestry nonprofit housed at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. And in this video, I'm going to walk through our methodology for siting and choosing a street tree here in the city of New Haven. First, I'm going to give a very brief introduction to Urban Resources Initiative, or URI's public tree planting programs. We work in partnership with the city of New Haven in all of our work, and our mission as an organization is to foster community-based land stewardship. But a secondary mission is to increase the tree canopy of the city and to maximize the benefits that urban trees provide. And so naturally, street tree planting is a big part of what we do in all of our work. So we've been planting trees with both volunteers and with our Green Jobs program for over 25 years. Community Green Space, which works primarily with volunteers, has been operating since 1995, and Green Skills, our street tree planting and Green Jobs program, has been operating since 2007. Both run on a request-based model. So if you are a resident or a business here in New Haven and there is space for a new street tree to be planted in the public right-of-way adjacent to your property, you are eligible to become a tree adopter. And we will plant those trees for free for a tree adopter, and then they agree to water the tree for the first 3 years during the tree's establishment period, after which the tree can hopefully thrive on its own. And through these two programs, Community Green Space and Green Skills, URI has planted over 8,000 trees throughout the city of New Haven. Because our programs run on a request-based model, as I explained, we need to do a lot of work to get the word out. So a lot of people hear about our programs through word of mouth, but we also spread the word on social media, through email newsletters, through lawn signs and small tags on trees, which you might see walking around the neighborhoods of New Haven, and also via postcards that can be dropped off at people's front doors, distributed at schools and community centers, or even distributed at New Haven hospitals. But once we get a request, whether it's in the mail, on the phone, by email, or through our web form, the next step is to respond to that tree request by doing a site visit and assessing the opportunity or opportunities to plant one or multiple trees at a site. And that is the process. The process that comes next is what I'm going to focus on for the rest of the video. So URI steps for site survey start with number one, asking, is there an opportunity to plant a tree at all? Number two, if we determine that there is an opportunity to plant a tree at the site, we identify the best location or locations for that tree to be planted in the public right-of-way. Number three, we make a species recommendation for each planting location, and this is where your skills as an arborist or a forester really come in handy. Background knowledge about unique tree species and their natural history and conditions in which they'll thrive, knowing all of those things means that you'll be able to make a better recommendation for the tree requester for a tree that is going to thrive in the long term and reach maturity. And then the last step is we record our site visit notes, both for our own records, but also to share with the tree requester so that together we can collaboratively come up with a final planting plan, both the final locations for the tree to be planted or the trees to be planted, and also the final species selection. This diagram is one that I love, courtesy of James Urban, who is a landscape architect who specializes in urban forestry and the soil requirements for successfully growing urban trees. He writes about the 6 critical requirements for growing a tree into maturity. All of these requirements are things that the urban forester has in their mind as they are assessing a site and making a recommendation for a new tree to be planted. Some of these characteristics are things that we can control, such as procuring quality rootstock from the nursery, or choosing a tree that's going to have enough room in the upper canopy to mature to its natural habit. Other things are not things that we can control necessarily, but we can choose the best tree for the constraints that we're given. So to walk through the process of site assessment and tree selection, we're going to travel virtually to a home in the Hill neighborhood of New Haven. And we're actually going to take a look at the blue house on the left side of your screen on DeWitt Street. So step one, we ask ourselves, is there an opportunity to plant a tree here? So the first thing that I always look for are existing trees, because we like to keep at least 25 feet in between existing trees so that there's enough room for trees to mature into their full canopy. We want to be thinking about, what is this tree, what is it going to look like in 10 years, in 20 years, in 50 years? And small trees spaced closely together might look nice now, but 30 years from now, they might be overcrowded and providing a burden really for the city and the adjacent homeowner to take care of. So we look for enough space between existing trees, and we also look for space between utilities and other infrastructure. So looking at this property head on, we see that there's a driveway we need to take into account. We keep at least 7 feet between a new tree planting site and a driveway, and that's to maintain sight lines, both for vehicles passing in and out of the driveway and also pedestrians that would be walking along the sidewalk. We also want to keep at least 30 feet to a stop sign or an intersection, and that's for the same reason, to keep adequate sight lines and visibility for vehicles along the road. That SCGOK is a nod to the Southern Connecticut Gas Company. We always call up the utilities after we've marked a site to come out and take a look and make sure that our proposed tree planting site is not obstructing any underground buried gas lines or water lines. And so if there are any obvious markers like gas meters along the house, we want to make sure that we're at least 4 feet off of any underground utility lines. And then we also want to look up at any utility wires overhead. We follow the right tree, right place policy, which I'll get into in a few slides. Generally, if we're planting underneath utility wires, in order to minimize the conflict between trees and utility lines in the future, we plant a smaller stature tree, one that is going to mature to a maximum of 35 feet or so, anytime we're planting under wires. But given all of those constraints, it does look like we will have room to plant a tree here. And the next step is to ask ourselves, where exactly should this tree go? So we always try to plant in the right-of-way, the public right-of-way, that's in the curb strip or a tree pit between the curb and the sidewalk. Sometimes there is no existing tree pit, but we do have the capacity and the tools to cut a new tree pit to a minimum dimension of 4 by 8 feet to provide enough space and soil volume for the tree to mature and have enough room for these trunk taper at the base. Here, there's definitely room to plant in the curb strip and the public right-of-way. We're going to be looking like we're planting the tree under utility wires. So we're going to want to choose a tree that is smaller in stature when it comes to making our species recommendation. We also want to take into account aesthetic balance, looking at the frontage of the property and thinking about where the tree could be placed that's going to be pleasing for the resident, and also keep up with the spacing pattern of existing trees on the block or potential future trees that might be planted. So it looks like we've chosen a nice spot here on the right side of the house. We paint a white T in the road so that our planting crews know where to plant the tree come planting day. The resident knows where we have proposed planting the tree and can give us feedback if they want the tree planted slightly to one direction or the other. And the utility companies can come and mark any potential conflicts so we know if we need to make adjustments on planting day. So once we have chosen our tree planting location, the next step is to take in lots of information about the surrounding environment so that we can make a good recommendation for possible tree species to be planted at the site. So we've already talked about looking for the presence of overhead utility lines. We can see here that there are some utility lines we need to take into account. We're going to look for the proximity of the planting site to other buildings. So if we're planting very close, within 30 feet of a building that's maybe 3 stories or higher, we're going to want to choose a species that has a more upright form, like a ginkgo tree, for example. We want to think about the overall character of the site and the character of the trees that we're planting. So if we have a whole row of oak trees along the block, we might want to choose a species that either matches another oak, one that's going to have a contrasting growing character, or one that matches. We also want to take into account the shade conditions, whether we're planting in a sunny site or a shady site, and we want to choose a tree species that's going to have its light requirements met. We want to think about salt loading. In the downtown areas, we know that there's, in our relatively harsh New England winters, there is a lot of salt loading that happens in the winter to reduce icing over the sidewalks and the streets. That salt can be very stressful for trees, and particularly stressful for those that are relatively intolerant of salt. And so we want to take special consideration when we're planting downtown. Here in this residential zone, I don't think that salt loading is going to be a particular problem. We want to look at the surrounding area to see what kinds of trees are planted along the block. Is there anything that we want to match or contrast? Our associate director, Chris Ozick, always also talks about consulting the genius of the place. If you notice that there is a dogwood tree planted next door that has anthracnose, then a dogwood is probably not going to be a good choice for here at this site that we're looking at either. Similarly, if there's a choke cherry that's planted that is struggling with black knot, you don't want to plant another cherry tree right next to it. It'll be more susceptible to the disease. So we're taking in all of that information, the genius of the place. And then we're also thinking about opportunities for planting trees that we might not be able to plant elsewhere. There's always an opportunity to plant many honey locusts, red maples. They're hardy trees, they're workhorses. They can go in pretty much anywhere. If you have a site where you can plant something special, like a sugar maple tree as a yard offset tree where there isn't going to be much salt loading and there's lots of soil volume, then awesome, do it. Maybe a tulip poplar would do well in that kind of site as well. If you have a wet site where it could be a good opportunity to plant a black gum, then great. We want to find those special opportunities to increase the diversity of our street tree canopy by planting trees that you don't see frequently elsewhere around the city. So I've spoken a little bit about the right tree, right place policy, and I want to expand upon that a little bit more. When we have overhead utility lines, like you can see on the right side of the screen in this image, we want to choose a tree that is going to remain relatively small, even at maturity, so we're not creating conflicts down the road with overhead utility lines. With that said, if there is overhead space to plant a shade tree, because shade trees grow taller, they live longer, and provide more benefits per tree, those benefits that we depend on, like cooling in the summer, flood control and stormwater management during heavy rain events, carbon capture, wildlife habitat, you name it. We want to maximize the benefits of tree planting by planting those shade trees everywhere we have the opportunity to. So that's why we plant small trees under wires and larger shade trees pretty much everywhere else. But overhead spaces and everything, like I've mentioned, we also want to take into account the light characteristics, the soil moisture, salt loading, pollution loading, the available soil volume, and all of the other surrounding characteristics that might help us choose the right tree for the right place. So at URI, we have this awesome tool to help us make a good decision based on different site characteristics. So here for the site that we've been looking at, we can see it's in a residential zone. There are wires overhead, and we're pretty much in a full sun site. So in that red circle, you can see a list of trees that we generally keep in our inventory that we know grow successfully here in New Haven. These are trees that we can pull from when making a species recommendation for this kind of site here in New Haven. This tree diagram legend helps you get a little bit more into the details of each tree, its growing habit, how large it might get at maturity, vertically, horizontally, what its fall foliage color will look like, whether or not it has showy flowers in the springtime. And these are all really good talking points for you to be able to communicate with a tree requester who might have specific preferences as to the kind of tree that they're looking for the site in front of their home or business. So if you're talking with a requester who really wants to have showy flowers in the springtime, for this site that we've been looking at on DeWitt Street, in full sun with overhead wires, we know that the Ammermachia, the cherry, the crabapple, the hawthorn, the Japanese tree lilac, and the serviceberry match all of those site constraints that we need to take into account, and also meet those values that the tree requester has. If they're instead looking for fall color, you might recommend a different set of species for them to choose from, adding the trident maple and the American hornbeam, for example. All the while, we're also remembering that we have a limited inventory to work with. So we order all of our trees. These are 2-inch caliper ball and burlap trees from wholesale nurseries across the Northeast. We order them in August for the following 2 seasons. And so we have a limited inventory that we're pulling from, and we have to keep track of what we have. So this is just a look into the back end of our system. We are keeping track of the total anticipated number of trees that we're going to have in our storage yard, how many have already been assigned for planting, and how many are still available for new sites to be scheduled. So all of this we need to be thinking about when we're making a recommendation for a new tree planting site. when we are doing our ordering and stocking our inventory, we're always thinking about promoting diversity. And we try and plant no more than 5% of any given species, 10% of any given genus, and 15% of any given family. And that's to maintain a resilient urban forest. Okay, so once we have done our site assessment, thought about our species recommendation, taken into account what we have existing in our inventory, and thought about any special opportunities we might have to plant a unique tree. Now we're going to be writing up our notes and sharing them with the tree requester. We have a door tag that we use if we're not able to speak to the requester in person or on the phone, so that they can read about all the information that we collected and follow up with us to help make the final decision. As I mentioned, it's a collaborative process. The tree requester, we go through a lot of effort to make sure that they're bought into the process of making decisions, and then really valuing the tree, this environmental asset that they are going to be pouring their energy into taking care of and enjoying for years to come. So in this case, we mark that there's an opportunity for one tree to be planted, that there are wires overhead. And given their preference for a native tree with fall color, we've made the recommendation of choosing between an American hornbeam, a hawthorn, or a serviceberry, which we think would all be great choices. All right, so at this point, we're gonna head out into the field and take a look at two different locations, real tree request sites on the ground here in New Haven.
So here we are at our first field site to walk through the process of site survey for planting a new tree. We're going to be taking a look at the spot in front of this building here. So first step, is there an opportunity to plant a tree? And I want to check, is there adequate distance between existing trees and any important utility or infrastructure? So I can see that there's a tree planted down there. I've already paced out 25 feet from that tree. As an urban forester, it's good to know your pacing so that you don't have to bring a tape measure out. I know that each of my steps is about 2.5 feet, so 10 steps, that's 25 feet. There's certainly enough space on this side of the walkway. I've also estimated 7 feet from the edge of the driveway. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So as long as we plant on this side of the dot down here, we're okay. So I definitely think there's room to plant this tree. Now, to decide upon an exact location, we want to take into account any underground utilities that I see. So like this is a gas line that I want to keep at least 4 feet off from. I know there's a water line close to the walkway. So somewhere in between, and you can probably see this large stump here. It's actually pretty well centered on the middle of the building. I think this is a great place to plant the tree. It's going to require a stump grind, but that's something that we can request from the city of New Haven. So I'm going to mark a white T along the curb so that our planting crews know where to plant. Utilities can come and mark the underground lines, which they've already done, but they will remark them, and the tree requester can know where we're planning to plant the tree. So step 3, making a species recommendation. We want to take in some additional information from around the site. So I can see that there is a hawthorn tree planted down at the site next door. I can also see that there are some standing dead ash trees and declining Norway maples along the bunch of newer trees that have been planted as replacements. So it might make sense to choose a tree that's part of the species assemblage of the newer trees that have been planted. I see a serviceberry, a crabapple, a hawthorn, like I mentioned, some Japanese tree lilac. So choosing one of those species would help to match some of the existing character without sort of falling into a monoculture. There are also wires overhead, so it's important to choose a smaller stature tree to follow right tree, right place. So I might provide an option of maybe 5 of those trees that I mentioned already. Perhaps throw cherry tree in there as well. It's a sunny spot, so we're not going to be able to plant a dogwood or a redbud, something that requires more shade to thrive. Now, the last step would be to record my notes, to communicate with the requester. This is the point where I would fill out this tree request site survey form and leave it on the door handle. And there's all of the information that the tree requester needs to get back to us and to make their final decisions so we can schedule a planting day. Great, we're gonna head to another site now to check out a different set of constraints. So this is a site where we've already done the site assessment and marked it for 2 new trees to go in. As you can see, there were 2 large stumps that were removed from the planting site, and they already have their white T's marked in the road. Some things to make note of: there are no wires overhead. So we know we're going to be planting a shade tree or 2 shade trees. There's definitely enough room off of this utility pole, at least 10 feet. There's 25 feet between the 2 planting sites. And we know that the gas company and the water company have marked that they're okay here, no underground utility lines. And on this side, there's a water line marked in blue and a gas line marked in orange or yellow, and we're at least 4 feet off from the planting site on this side, so we are okay. So both locations are sound, even taking the utility conflicts into account. So next step is to choose a suitable tree species for the site, and we actually had specific requests from the residents here to plant oak trees that match some of the existing trees on the street. There's an oak tree planted to my right. There are, it looks like, a few elms on the street as well. Both are good options. There's a London plane down there that way. Really anything that's a large shade tree that will do well in a sunny location is going to be a great choice. We chose 2 red oaks to go here, and they're going to look great and thrive and have plenty of room for their trunk taper and root flare here in this large curb strip with a nice sunny place to grow. So that's it for our field visits. Thank you for watching the video. Hope you learned some things about our methodology for site survey and tree choices.